All right, guys, Nick here, continuing on with the how to make your own seduction method. And this lesson we call Begin with the End in Mind. So let's just dive right in. Around 1995, I got my hands on a book that actually had a very profound effect over my thinking process and really how to live a good life just in general and have good habits. It's called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I'm sure you've heard of it unless you've been living under a rock somewhere. Anyhow, habit number 2 in this book is called Begin with the End in Mind. And in just a moment, you're going to see just how potent this one idea is when it comes to getting laid as well. Even though that book had absolutely nothing to do with getting laid. You're going to see how it's going to affect you in just a minute. So in that book, Stephen Covey talks about how all things are created twice. There is the mental part and there is the physical part. And when it comes to seduction, it's no different. And a lot of you guys have no problem with the mental part. You're constantly thinking about sex. You're constantly thinking about how can I hook up with that next hot, beautiful girl. And you're having trouble with the physical part. And it's because you're only focusing on that mental part. And even when you're focusing on that mental part, it's not clearly focused on how to bridge the gap between the mental and the physical. So the problem is this. Although most guys have no problem imagining the end, thinking about it, when it comes to actually attempting to seduce, they focus solely on the beginning, the opening, the approaching part of seduction. But I want to tell you something and write this down, burn it into the back of your brain. It's all closing game. There is no such thing as approach game transitioning. It's all closing game. And if you do seduction properly, you'll realize that all you're ever doing is closing from the very beginning. So, what's the significance of all this? Last minute resistance really only exists for those who are thinking about seduction backwards. There are 2 ways of thinking about seduction. There's the amateur wannabe way, where you're only working on opening game. What I mean by that is you only worry about what to open with, what's a good line to start the interaction off with. You think about how to transition that into a conversation. You're thinking of different ways to escalate, and you get stuck in this phase forever. You never seem to progress and get any better at seduction. But let me reveal to you how a consistent pro, the kind of guy that gets laid all of the time, thinks about it. He thinks only about the end goal. And of course, what I mean by the end goal is sex. And he finds that sex is more consistent, and paradoxically, it's actually easier to get. So I wanted to give an example of this kind of thinking. There's a guy named Josh Waitzkin, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name properly, but he was a chess prodigy as a kid. And in fact, the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer is all about him, if you've ever seen that movie. But one interesting thing about him learning how to be this world-class chess player is that his first coach, Bruce Pandolfini, started the very first lesson with Endgame. He started with a pawn and 2 kings on the board, and that was it, which is the kind of scenario that you'd only be in the end phases of a chess match. Josh went on to win more titles than I even bother mentioning, and as a kid, because he learned how to play by starting with everything at the very end of the chess match. Now, the same thing is the case when it comes to pro poker players. You know, I could teach you really quickly how to do the first couple rounds of the game, you know, which hole cards are stronger than others. I could show you how to play the flop pretty quickly, but pros, the ones who win big time money and where they have their biggest edge over the average fish at the table is playing on the turn in the river, those last 2 betting rounds. Once again, you see that the real edge of the professional is being able to manage and finagle those last stages of it. I mentioned this in an earlier video about my only 2 thoughts about seduction. And in fact, when I thought about this, this is what revolutionized my ability to get laid consistently. I really am only thinking about 2 things. 1, can I get her to a place where sex is realistically possible? And when I do, can I get her at least somewhat turned on? If my answer is yes, if I can get the answer to yes on both of these questions, then I know I'm getting laid. And these are really only endgame concepts, but they're the only thoughts that are running through my head in any given interaction. I want to introduce you to a concept I call cart before the horse. And basically what this is every time that I take a student out for live coaching, He will have a series of missions that I want him to accomplish that night, but there's always one prime objective, and it never changes, and it's something that he will be doing every time he goes out. The prime objective, the modus operandi, what I want him to achieve is simply to get laid. Plain and simple. That's it. If you could do that, mission accomplished, game over, you win. Here's the deal. You're going to be in a lot of situations where you don't know exactly what to do to make that happen. But you're going to have to try to make that happen anyway. Now, I've included this little pirate map kind of as a metaphor for what this is all about and this image of Las Vegas. Listen, here's the deal. A lot of times I would be driving around in Las Vegas and I wouldn't know exactly how to get to my destination. But I knew that on the east side of the valley there was a mountain range, and on the west side of the valley there was another mountain range, and then somewhere in between that, you had the lights from the Luxor coming up, you had the stratosphere, and from that I can oftentimes feel my way to exactly where I needed to go, just because I had those as kind of a basis of where to steer. Your basis for where to steer the interaction is sex. And sure, you're not always going to know exactly how to make that happen, but you're going to steer the interaction towards that anyways, even if you're not sure exactly how to do that. So finally, lesson number 3. I want you to focus your attention strictly on getting laid. Let all the other details that come before it fall to the wayside and only begin with that end in mind. Focus on how you're going to make that sex happen, and you're going to find that that sex happens a lot more often than you could have ever imagined previously. All right, so that's it for today. I'm Nick, and go out there and get some.